All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all can hear me and see me well. We are going to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart, and that is of science of wind farm wakes. And we're going to talk about the problems from a legal and economic perspective, as well as related to issues on meteorology. My name is Ignacio Herrera-Anchustegui. I'm the leader of Coast Research Center for Climate, Energy, and Sustainability Law of the University of Bergen. And this event has been co-organized with the Bergen Offshore Wind Center, and which is led by Christian Gebhardt, my colleague, who is also here. And today I'm just simply saying welcome to everybody because we have a special moderator host of the day, which is PhD Eirik Finseros. Eirik is a lawyer working in Viggo Rhein. He's a specialist in some of these matters. He has a PhD from the University of Bergen, so we know him quite well, but he has been working for a while already in private practice, where he is working on these different matters. And along Eirik, that is going to be our moderator today, and I'll give the word to him. We have three specialists on this topic, and I will let Eirik introduce the event and the speakers. So Eirik, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Well, given that you just introduced me, I'm not going to waste any time by introducing myself. But like Ignacio said, I have worked with wind wakes myself because Etienne and Ignacio and we wrote an article back in the day in early 2024. I think it was published. The title, I believe, was Gone with the Wind, a tale of regulatory gaps and so forth, which was a very interesting project because, as you may imagine, we uncovered some rather significant issues which can have some rather serious policy implications for the energy transition at large, particularly the offshore one. So that is pretty much the topic that we are covering today. So we'll be going through some of the presentations with Etienne, Georg, and Matthias online. And then after that, we'll be doing a Q&A. And for the Q&A, I do invite you all to submit questions in the chat. We'll also be taking questions from the room itself. So that will be very exciting. But without further ado, I think we're going to start off with Etienne. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my name is Etienne Chenet. I am an associate professor at the Geophysical Institute, the Bergen Offshore Wind Center at the University of Bergen. And so I will talk, I'm the first one to present here, and the title of my presentation is Science of Wind Farm Waves. This is quite broad. So I decided to narrow down the scope to a few questions. And I decided actually to organize my presentation around a set of 8 questions. So that's the menu of the day. I will start with what are wind turbine waves, so a definition. I will move towards something that is maybe more relevant for today, which is the definition of what are wind farm waves. I will mention some of the key concerns regarding wind farm waves, especially for wind farm operators and developers. I will focus on 2 specific concerns. The first one is whether wind farm waves may add some additional damage on wind farms downstream, so reduce the lifespan of turbines. And I will address this, maybe one of the big concerns, which is the energy production in the farm downstream and whether this leads to financial loss. Maybe the most important question I want to address today is how difficult is it to quantify farm wake losses? So the spoiler is it's very difficult. Now we may think, oh, there are technological solutions. There are, but today I want to actually address one solution which is maybe the most intuitive one, which is why not simply increasing the spacing between turbines? And I will address in the last question non-technological strategy to address farm-to-farm wake loss. So 8 questions, 2 definitions, 3 concerns, 4 concerns, and then two slides about solutions. So the first question, what are wind turbine waves? I tried to find the simplest definition possible. So I wrote A wind turbine weight is the region downstream of another turbine or row of turbines, which is associated with lower wind speeds, higher turbulence, at least compared to the upstream undisturbed conditions. So the physical interpretation is that a wind turbine is a power plant which extracts energy from the wind. So as the winds go through the rotor plane, we have a local depletion of wind resources, which translates into a lower wind speed. So now wind farm weight is the merging of a lot of individual wind turbine weights. You may even have cluster weights, the weights of cluster of farms. But here, wind farm weight is about the weight generated by one wind farm. Maybe the easiest way to visualize the weight of a wind farm is to use satellite data. So here I have what we call satellite remote sensing of the wind speeds 10 meters above the surface of the sea. This was recorded north of Germany in the North Sea. And I labeled as many small red dots wind turbines. The wind was blowing from the east on that day, and the dark blue area you see are actually wind farm weight. So I have, for example, one here. I chose this day because this was the sample that has shown waves can be more than 100 kilometers. So that's the longest I have been able to find. It doesn't happen often, but here we actually see a pretty impressive drop in wind speed. So if you are, let's say, the operator of the wind farm on the east side, you will create a weight that will somehow impact the wind farm downstream. And the operator of the wind farm downstream will produce less energy because the first wind farm has already extracted some energy from the wind. So the operator of the second wind farm will say, well, you, the guy from the first wind farm, you stole my wind. And so this can create conflicts. So that's actually lead me to this question about what are the main concerns about wind farm weights for operators and wind farm developers. I think the most intuitive concern is about revenue loss. If we produce less energy, we don't make as much money as if there was no weight. The second concern is about this increased turbulence. I have seen, for example, some questions about whether this can lead to higher fatigue damage for wind turbines downstream, which means the lifespan of the turbine downstream may be reduced. And indirectly, it means also financial loss. And finally, I wanted to say that we have a lack of legal framework to regulate farm-to-farm weight effect, and that is, I think, a concern. Because, I mean, this was actually the topic of Eric's paper. And without somehow such a framework to anticipate possible conflicts, we may see a slowdown in the development of an offshore wind industry in Europe. So we need a convenient legal framework. Now, I will spend the next two slides on the two specific concerns, loss of wind energy and possible reduction in the lifespan of wind turbines. So the big question is, do wind farm weights significantly reduce the energy produced at wind farms downstream? From what the literature say, I would say yes, probably. But we don't know actually by how much. And this is a big question. If you want to know actually at least one study that is trying to quantify weight loss from wind farms, I will recommend this one. So I will share the PowerPoint at the end, which was published 4 years ago by a couple of famous scientists from Cornell University. And they were interested in modeling weight loss on the east coast of the USA, assuming that there is a development of massive wind farms. And the results they have are quite concerning, but I would say these are simulations. We have no idea how it will be in reality. So we have to keep in mind that we have big uncertainties there. the second question, which is about whether wind farms can shorten the lifespan of downstream wind farms. I would say from a recent paper published 3 months ago, probably no. And this paper is not about simulation. They had access to real measurement from turbines. And what they saw was far away from the first upstream wind farms, there was only a tiny increase in loading. And the argument for this concern is maybe overstated, is that yes, there may be a slight increase in turbulence, but there is also a decrease in the mean wind speed. If there is less wind, you have less loading. So that's a good news. So I think the main concern here is about the profitability of wind farms if there are significant weight loss. Now, I would like to address this quantification problem. How difficult is it to quantify farm-to-farm weight losses? So this is quite difficult, partly because some of the farms that are not built yet. So we have to rely on simulations. In the industry, what we call analytical weight model or engineering weight model is widely used. I personally like a lot these models. They are very efficient. You can run them on a laptop. These models are pretty good also at describing weight loss inside a single wind farm, or if you want, between turbines. But they are not very good at quantifying weight loss between farms. If you want a good illustration of this issue, I will recommend this paper that was published 3 years ago. And I think it's one of the few good comparison of different way to model waves. And this paper really highlights the limits of analytical wave model. So in my opinion, if we want to further use this model for farm-to-farm weight interaction, we need more measurement. We need to actually be able to quantify using set of sensors the wind velocity deficit downstream of turbines. And then we can hope we can improve this analytical weight model, and then we can put a more variable number on weight losses. So this is, I would say, a knowledge gap. Those actually who have real data for weight losses are wind farm operators, but there's also sensitive data, so I don't think they were willing to share this data with scientists. At least I know this is a challenge. So one of the most intuitive solutions is simply to increase the spacing between turbines. Okay, the further turbines are apart, the less weight loss we have. Now, if we consider the fact that an offshore wind farm is it's not a very profitable power plant, it means that we have to be very careful with the levelized cost of energy, which is basically the cost of electricity production. And we don't have a lot of room for errors. So here I kind of oversimplified the equation for the levelized cost of energy, LCOE, which is the ratio between the initial investments, capital expenditure, plus operation and maintenance, divided by the energy produced during the lifespan of a wind farm. So let's say we are willing to put turbines very far apart, which means in the end, the capacity factor increase for our wind farm, which is good because if the capacity factor increase, the levelized cost of energy should decrease too. But because we need subsea cable and the distance between the turbine increase, we need to invest more in subsea cables, and this costs a lot of money. So in the end, putting turbines too far apart may be counterproductive because we won't be able to reduce the LCOE. We can adopt the opposite approach. We are willing to sacrifice some of the energy production to reduce the use of subsea cables, so we pack turbines together. So we manage to reduce the CapEx here, but at the cost of a capacity factor which will drop. Which means in the end, we also take the risk to have a higher LCOE than expected. So we need to find a trade-off between turbines too close to each other and turbines too far apart. This question was partly addressed in a paper published 8 years ago. I like this paper a lot but this is, I would say, an idealized study. So simulations and infinitely large wind farm. But the author, they try to put a number. What is the optimal spacing for offshore turbines? And the recommendation was 10 rotor diameter, at least. Now, I don't know if this is a number we should trust, but at least we have an estimate. And so far in the North Sea, the turbine spacing is between 4 rotor diameter and 8 rotor diameter. So what they recommend is spacing larger than what is done nowadays. So you can keep this number in mind, but also that this is from one study, which is a simulation. Now, if we think about non-technological strategy to mitigate wind farm to wind farm weight losses, I would say the simplest one is to actually communicate. That's what we call coordinated wind farm development. There is another paper that I will recommend that was published 6 years ago by Lundqvist and co-authors in Nature Energy. They actually warned about the danger of uncoordinated wind energy development. And often the solution is simply to be transparent, to communicate between wind farm operator to know, okay, what you plan to do, what do I plan to do. Maybe a more actionable plan was proposed, I think, 2 years ago, in a paper also in a pretty big journal. And the authors mention trading rights, which is the upstream wind farms will on purpose decide to produce a little less energy so that the wind farm downstream can produce more than initially. And then the wind farm downstream will compensate the wind farm upstream. So this sounds a little strange, but from this study, the conclusion was trading right is a win-win situation between different wind farms operators. Okay. And again, this requires cooperation.
Okay.
One minute, perfect. Conclusion, very quickly. What we know so well are wind turbine waves. What we don't know so well are farm-induced waves. Okay. The main reason is, that we actually need to combine scales that are not compatible, so from a few dozen meters to hundreds of kilometers. And the quantification of weight losses is really what we miss. So if we want to put variable numbers on weight losses for between wind farms, we need more measurements so that we can improve our models. My take-home message is that weight losses are unavoidable. We have to deal with them, but they are not a showstopper. I think the main criteria for designing a wind farm is the mean wind speed. And I will go even further by stating that I think it's more acceptable to have some large weight losses in an outstanding location for wind farms than to really have small weight loss in a poor location with small turbines. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Etienne. That was I think that serves as a really good introduction actually to our next two speakers on the agenda. So we've had some really good, I suppose, facts presented by Etienne, who comes from the hard sciences, as it were. So now we're going to move on to the soft sciences, to the legal side of things and also the financial aspect, which Etienne touched upon. He mentioned revenue loss, and he also mentioned some legal issues. So next on the agenda, we have Georg, who's come from, where are you based?
Hamburg.
In Hamburg, exactly, yeah, who works in Luther law firm with complex disputes in particular. So I think I'm going to give the word to you, and if you could introduce yourself as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Happy to, thank you very much.
Before I give the word to Georg, I just want to check that you are seeing the slides of Georg and not the slides of Etienne anymore online. You see the ones that is from Luther with white.
Working.
Yes, Kenny? Okay, excellent. Georg,
Thank you very much.
you can click here.
So thank you very much for having me and for the kind invitation and the great presentation by Etienne just now. I'm a partner at Luther Law Firm, and our energy practice has been accompanying a number of offshore wind projects in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, and around the world. I'm primarily a disputes lawyer, and I look at issues that can arise during construction, during the sale of offshore wind projects, the financing, and all sorts of different aspects. And the topic of wake effects is a really exciting topic. But when lawyers say something exciting, clients generally say it's a nightmare, right? So, and especially true here, and as Etienne has pointed out, that there's loads of uncertainty. It's not clear-cut case yet. You know, what is the wake effect? How can we model it? Can we model turbulences at all? Which is a big question, I think. So I think that there are loads of factual open questions, and I just wanted to flag a few legal issues. And the title says wind theft, which raises the first question, which I'm going to leave unanswered. If you want to steal something, you have to figure out who owns it, right? So who owns the wind? Is it a shared resource? Is it a resource you buy into when you participate in an offshore wind auction? Like, you know, rights when you buy a skyscraper and you want to maintain your view in Manhattan or something like that. So it's a big question of who actually owns this natural resource. But let me take you, or just flag a few points. There are currently a number of disputes, wake loss disputes, especially in the territorial waters of the UK. Some have been settled through wake loss agreements, and Etienne mentioned some concepts how a distribution could work out to the benefit of both or multiple wind farms. Some have not yet been settled because it's just too difficult to figure out how to calculate or how to create a mechanism by which to calculate how much the one or the other lost, right? And you see the windrows I put in here, the wind turns. I mean, surely it comes out of one direction to a certain degree, to a certain percentage of the time. But generally, it's not that easy to say, you cost me 5 to 15% of my capacity. So that's a factual problem that makes wake loss agreements and commercial settlements between parties extremely difficult. Now, let me move on. These are some of the examples that you saw on the previous slide. And here, the companies estimated, at least publicly, the drop of energy production somewhere between 0.5 and roughly 5.5%. As I understand the studies that are currently available, they can be much, much higher than this. They can be up to 10, 12%, but we don't know yet, right? As Etienne said, how big is the effect, or is there effect? Probably, right, was the answer. So we will have to see. But these disputes were ongoing, or some of them are ongoing, and some were solved through the pressure of the UK government to sort it out amongst themselves. And the government just raised their hands and said, it's not our job, we just gave away the license, and you deal with the impact. They often give the example that if you open a coffee shop next to another coffee shop and you don't get any business, it's your problem. It's a very simplified answer, which I think does not do any justice to the problems that these wind farms have. And as Etienne mentioned, the idea is to not to have huge spacing between wind farms, but to have a coordinated approach, use the limited space we have available in the most efficient way. And limited space sounds kind of weird when you think about seas, but if you look at the Baltic Sea and all the protected environmental areas and all the other sort of areas where you cannot build wind farms, there's actually limited space, right? I was recently at a conference in India, and they call the Baltic Sea a bathtub, right? Because they have, you know, they have a huge coastline, they have plenty of space, and they can use spacing as a method to avoid wind wake effects. We can't, and that's why we have to strike a compromise. Now, what is the legal recourse? And I'm going to come to that right at the end, my fourth point. The first 3 points, I just want to highlight where wind wake effects come into play or need to be considered by players in the industry. The first one is, of course, the planning stage, right? Most governments, or not most governments, the UK has started and some countries have followed suit to require operators to provide wind wake assessments before they get a license, right? But the reliability is a big question. But they're trying to avoid liability vis-a-vis the state by putting that on and saying, you put in an assessment, there's no wind wake effect, build it, and the rest is yours, right? So that's certainly a big consideration. Secondly, I mean, what are the limits? You build a wind farm now and you hand in a wind wake assessment, and 5, 6, 7 years down the line, somebody else builds a new wind park upstream or repowers significantly. And we've seen the development of wind turbines going up exponentially. And suddenly you have a problem, and your wind assessment that you did at the beginning is essentially worthless. So you really have to take that into account. And the question is, can you really make an informed decision at the time of planning? And that's a good question. Of course, countries can ask for wind wake effects, but they also need to coordinate across borders. I mean, especially in the North and Baltic Sea, the territorial waters are very close to each other, and it's not sufficient to coordinate nationally, but it's necessary to coordinate internationally between countries that have bordering or water lines that border on each other. So this is really key. The second problem, this is the first one. This is an example from the UK, who said, we need wind wake assessments before we give you a license. I think they were one of the first ones. Now, recently in their new national policy statement, they gave some guidance on how this should work, which I find as a lawyer, and that's already a lot, to very vague actually. They say that, you know, the parties or the applicants are encouraged to behave in a good neighborly way, whatever that means, right? They should, try, attempt all reasonable endeavors. And finally, they say, well, it's a commercial matter managed between the developers, and we're not going to adjudicate these disputes. And that raises two questions for me. First of all, how can you have a dispute between two developers, right? You can have a dispute under tort law, certainly not under contract law, for public nuisance. So one sort of infringes upon the rights of the others, and in numerous jurisdictions, there's a claim for some kind of nuisance. And you can build on that theoretically, right? But the question is, the other party who's being sued for a nuisance will always say, but the government gave me a license, and the government asked me for a wake assessment. Oh, sorry, it turned out to be wrong, but I did my best at the time when I sort of procured that assessment. So I think nuisance claims between parties will be extremely, extremely difficult. The other thing you could have are claims against the government. In many jurisdictions, you can have administrative claims saying, listen, I participated in this auction. I gave a certain price. You awarded me the contract. And now 2 years later, you're awarding another wind farm, a big space in the Baltic or the Northern Sea. And this is not the bargain that I signed up for. So under many jurisdictions, many or quite a few jurisdictions that I've looked at, you could actually have or entertain a claim against the government. The UK government is trying to get out of this. I don't think they will, but we'll see how it develops. This is still relatively new. The second stage is construction and financing. And Etienne touched upon construction. There were concerns that you have to design wind parks differently because of increased turbulences. We understand now that this risk is relatively low, may still be there in certain constellations. So there may be different lifetime expectations, especially when it comes to repowering. Then we have wake loss agreements that could be concluded relatively early on. And then we have the issue of financing. Financing banks want very specific data on returns. And they want probably even more specific assessments on wake losses and potential future plans of other wind parks. So you're not going to get, or financing is going to become more difficult through this issue of wind wake effects. The next stage, which I'm just going to touch very briefly on, is post-M&A and publicly traded assets. Many developers develop offshore wind parks and then sell them straight away. That happens on a not daily basis, but on a very common basis. And the problem is always, what do I have to disclose? Do I have to disclose certain wind wake effects? Do I have to provide assessments? Does there have to be an extended due diligence? Will there be further post-M&A disputes resulting from the sale of offshore wind parks? Or if I sell a wind park, do I have to make a big cut to the purchase price or sale price because I'm suffering from a wind wake effect? And who can I seek recourse to? That's one issue. And the question is also in these M&A contracts, you buy something and is a then later occurring wind wake effect a material adverse change to your transaction? Can you reverse the transaction and ask for an adjustment of the purchase price if it didn't turn out as expected or as promised by the seller? The other one is, but that's a relatively recent phenomenon, that publicly traded funds have sort of compiled offshore assets and people can buy publicly traded shares. For that, they have to give out a prospectus, of course, about the risks and the returns. And they would also have to include assessments on wake losses and reductions that could occur in the future. So there's also an issue of prospectus liability, but I'm going to leave it at that and come to the final stage, the legal recourse that I see in the medium and long term. Now, you have two situations. You have a situation where you have a wind park in one country's territorial waters or exclusive economic zone, right? An incumbent wind farm. And you have a foreign newcomer. And if the first wind park is also a foreign investor and suffers from a wake loss effect, and he doesn't happen to be a European investor because it's kind of difficult with investment protection these days within the European Union. But if he's a foreign investor, which we do have in the Northern Sea, we have foreign investors from all over the world investing in wind parks. Then theoretically, that investor could have an investment claim against the state and simply say, you may not have expropriated my wind farm because it still works and makes money, right? But you have not afforded fair and equitable treatment to me because you have permitted a wind farm to steal my wind, right? It's just an idea I'm going to put out there. There's still a lot of thresholds which you have to meet. And of course, the state can always say, I procured a wake assessment, right? I did this and that. I try to exculpate myself. But it's certainly a possibility for non-European investors investing in these wind farms if they're affected within the same territorial waters. So investment protection is certainly a possibility that you should look into, and that European companies should look into when they invest, because they could restructure their investments to a country outside of the European Union, thereby obtaining or maintaining investment protection and securing against wake effects. The last one is transboundary wind effects. You may have 1 minute for transboundary. Thank you very much. So transboundary wind effects, as I said, we have many countries in the Baltic and Northern Sea that, basically the territorial waters are adjacent to each other, or at least the exclusive economic zones. What happens if a wind park in one country affects the one in the other country? That's not a case for investment protection, because the park investing in one country is obviously not a foreign investor in the other country. So there's no foreign investor, there's no host state, there's just two countries with two wind parks. So what can you do about that? And the thing we came up with in an essay that we published is that the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea could be a possible solution. And the International Convention for the Law of the Sea actually mentions wind as a resource, like the seabed, like waterways, like pollution issues. So why not in the medium or long term engage the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea under the International Convention to deal with these issues? It's currently sitting in Hamburg, but it's not very busy. It's a very nice building, but they don't have many cases. But they could actually deal with these cases. And they could deal with these cases because it's not only states that can file claims before that International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas. They can also give their right to private individuals. They can pursue cases there. And the standard the tribunal would have to apply is the standard of due regard. Now, that's a very vague statement, but in investment arbitration, we had the statement of fair and equitable treatment. That was also really vague 50 years ago. But in the last 50 years, the tribunals developed jurisprudence, what due regard means. And maybe the court just has to figure out in the next couple of years what due regard means in terms of spacing, in terms of coordinating. And I think that could be a viable solution. And the idea is that countries, and doesn't have to be all the countries that are part of the UNCLOS Convention, for example, neighboring countries to the Baltic Sea or the North Sea could sign an agreement and saying, we're going to give our companies a right to go to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Seas and file claims for wake losses. And they would have to look at it, at least from a legal perspective. Quantification may be a different issue, but they would have to look at and figure out whether there has been a transboundary breach or transboundary wake effect. But that's something sort of looking into the future out of desperation, because we don't have anything in the present to deal with that as a matter of dispute resolution. Thank you very much. That was it already.
Thank you so much, Georg. On the contrary, I don't think that was a nightmare. I think that was very interesting. Considering we are slightly ahead of schedule, behind schedule, I think we're just going to jump straight into it and give the word to Matthias, who's going to cover, well, I suppose, financial aspects of wake losses. So I'll just hand over the word to you, Matthias, who's joined us online, I believe.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all see my presentation and hear me okay.
We can hear you.
Matthias, your presentation I can see online. For some reason, we cannot see it here. So just give me a second.
Okay.
I'm going to do something that I don't like doing.
I mean, like to use the time, I can already introduce.
Well, I manage. I don't have a PhD in computers, but almost.
There we are, Matthias. We can see your presentation now. Go ahead.
Excellent. Great.
Thank
Hope
you.
it's not too small for you guys, but I will lead you through anyways. So yeah, thanks again for inviting me, and sorry that I cannot be around in person today. I already learned a lot from the previous two presentations, so thanks for that. And I will now try to build on that and add a bit of an economic and commercial financial angle to it. Just quickly on Frontier Economics, my employee, we are a so-called economic consultancy. We work across Europe. I'm personally located in Germany, and we work within energy. We work across the different practices and topics, and that includes market design, auction design, which is kind of relevant here, but also like dispute support as economic expert witnesses, which may also be very, very relevant for the wake effect topic. So let's start with kind of acknowledging that wake effects are there. They can be significant. It's uncertain, like to what extent, as we have already learned from Etienne. Here I pulled out an example of a recent paper which is estimating that the effect on yearly production can even be up to 20% if we think about like expanding North Sea wind offshore substantially until 2030. That may be on the higher side. It just shows the potential kind of range of the effect. And it's very important to note, and I think Etienne has already confirmed that the level of wake effects depends largely on a lot of factors, like the local wind conditions and the wind farm layouts, etc. So it will always be site specific, and there's no kind of generic number that can be used to estimate wake effects. And wake effects may lead to multiple risks, as we have already learned today, for both the developer of an offshore wind farm and also for authorities, as Georg has just set out. So I will keep that short and discuss potential levers to mitigate and manage wake effects. And I have tried to structure that across both the kind of the parties that can and should manage wake effects, the authorities, as we have already learned, like they may be sued, and equally the developers themselves, so the commercial perspective. And then equally there's measures that can be taken ex ante, and measures can be taken ex post, like once a wind farm is already there. And for now, I want to focus on this planning and approval process from authority perspective, because we have already learned that like the spacing of wind farms does have quite an impact on the level and shape of wake effects. So let's look into this first, and then come to other potential instruments as well. So I'm focusing on inter-farm spacing now, so not intra, so not within the farm, but between farms. And there's a recent example that may be of interest, and that is Germany, where the responsible planning authority, BSH, has recently suggested to reduce the density of offshore wind farms in a certain zone, this zone 4 that you see on the right-hand side, to reduce wake effects, because they kind of increasingly recognize that with a very dense spacing, there are substantial wake effects, and the levelized cost of electricity generation go up, and the profitability of wind farms go down. And there's like two countervailing effects of that. One is a system cost decreasing. So I'm now looking at it from a kind of system planner perspective. And there's obviously the effect that the utilization will go up, so full load hours will go up, and that reduces the LCOE. There may be an effect on the capture price that you can actually achieve. There's an effect on the cable cost, that with higher utilization, the specific costs go down. And there may be an effect on wear and tear as well and asset lifetime, although like we learned from Etienne, a recent paper suggests that this effect isn't really there. And then on the other hand side, there's a cost increasing effect, because when you reduce the density, you also reduce the potential capacity that you built in that area, and thus you reduce the electricity generation that you can provide in that area, and then you have to find other areas or other sources for that renewable electricity generation, and it could be other offshore areas. And I think Etienne already said that it may well be that then you have to move into areas where the full load hours, because the wind speed situation is worse, or you have to go to areas where the distance to shore is quite large and you have to build a very expensive cable. And then equally there may be more cable connection needed. So there's a trade-off to be made for a system planner when thinking about the optimal spacing. And this is something that's currently happening, being discussed in Germany, but equally in other countries, because as we learned, the space is scarce in the North Sea in particular. And now this all sounds comparatively easy, but if we look at it, it can be quite complex. And let's zoom into the kind of revenue side of things. So not even cost, just revenues. And we heard already that there's uncertainty and there's a bit of a knowledge gap of how severe wake effects are actually between wind farms. And it will, as I said, always be site specific anyways. And now just even if you have an idea or you have scenarios, I want to kind of show the complexity of it. So if we take the recent German example, there is like two potential estimations that you can look at. Like one is provided by BSH themselves, so that's the middle box there, who says if the capacity of generation of offshore wind farms is reduced by 10% through lower density, then full load hours of the remaining offshore wind farms will go up by 5%. And then if we take some assumptions on LCOE, so on cost, and that's what I've done here, then you will see that the LCOE of the remaining offshore wind goes down, so it's being reduced by roughly 5%. And LCOE, just as a reminder, is kind of the all cost divided by all generation. Like I'm an economist, so I need to take the present value, so discount for future cost and revenues. Otherwise, we've already seen that from Etienne. And then there's another estimation that we did in a recent study on offshore wind hydrogen. And there we have, with the help of some of the clients that work with, we have estimated that if we were to reduce the capacity in zone 4 by 50%, so half the capacity, then the full load hours would even increase by roughly 15%. And that will lower the levelized cost by something like 13%. So that would be massive, but as I said, and there would be lower capacity, so the generation would need to come from elsewhere. But all this LCOE considerations and full load hours, they're always only looking at the total generation of the year and the cost. They are not looking at the revenue and the actual value that electricity has in certain situations. So what we are actually interested in is also when wake effects occur within the year. So an hourly or even quarterly hourly consideration. And in my personal hypothesis, when I was thinking about this, was a bit like, well, maybe wake effects occur anyway, only when the wind is strong. And when the wind is strong, electricity prices are low. So maybe wake effects aren't that of a challenge. So we looked into this, and it's actually, this hypothesis is not true, if you want. So first, the correlation of electricity prices and wind offshore feed-ins is not very strong. So here's an example from Germany, and what you see is there's a bit of a negative trend, and you can analyze it more sophisticatedly than just looking at it, but it's very vague. So the more wind, the lower the price, but only very vaguely, and that looks completely different for PV, for example, in Germany. So it's not the case that when there's lots of wind, there's a low price, first. And second, it's also not the case that wake effects occur when wind is very strong. But in contrast, they occur in particular when the wind is kind of moderate. And here, an attempt to kind of illustrate that, here you see a so-called power curve. So the power output on the y-axis as a function of wind speed on the x-axis. And what you see is there's when the wind speed is very low, there's no power production anyway, so wake effects don't matter. And equally, when wind is very strong, then you are producing maximum capacity anyway, and then a bit of additional turbulences don't harm the power output much. So there is no big impact from wake effects. But where there's wake effects in this kind of moderate or mid load area, where wake effects have quite an impact on the output that you can generate. And we have then kind of turned that into what we call a generation duration curve. So that's like the hours of a year sorted by generation or by capacity factor here. And the red line is the duration curve without any wake effects. And then we have like exemplarity modeled some potential wake effects in this kind of mid-load that they see there. So the blue lines, these are different scenarios just to reflect what this means. And you see that in these different scenarios, the full load hours go down with additional wake effects, and there's a reduction in total electricity generation over the year of something between 1.3 and 6.6%. But as I said, that's like stylized, it's very simplified, but it's in the order that we heard before from the disputes that Georg referred to, for example. So what this means is it's complicated. You have to look into the details, also from authority point of view. So when you think about optimal spacing, it's quite an exercise, and you have to take all different elements into account. And I now focused on this spacing in planning and approval processes, but there's also other things authorities have to think about, like transparency, what Georg already mentioned, like what's the optimal risk allocation, kind of risk should the authorities take, what risk should TSOs take, and how can you reflect that in regulations, in the auction design, if there's auctions. And as Georg already mentioned, cross-border alignment is also very important and increasingly important in wind offshore. So that's all ex-ante measures. There's also a couple of ex-post measures. At the end, could always be kind of disputes if you haven't designed things thoroughly in the ex-ante stage. So now that's the authority perspective. Now briefly on the commercial perspective of an offshore wind farm. And there's a couple of very specific things in wake effects that make this special in a way. And we heard about that already. So limited influence is one. So this is the classic economic example of negative external effects. So the actions of one party have an impact on the profitability in this case of another party, and this makes like all sorts of coordination very important, like the agreements we learned about already, but also shows that like this strong coordination, this external effect, is kind of prone to legal disputes. And that's why we already see them and expect more of them going forward. Then it's all very dynamic. So first, there's the knowledge, or the better you are aware about future wake effects, the better you can manage them. And manage could mean, for example, if there's CFD auctions, you could price the wake effects in and ask for a higher strike price. That's one element, and then of course the wake effects can change over time. So without you doing anything on it, for example, if a neighboring offshore wind farm is being repowered, or there's a new build that you haven't expected. So it's very key that you kind of engage with this and think about this and model wake effects early on, already at the stage of financial investment decision, so that you are aware of what
Matthias, but you have about 1 minute left. Sorry.
Excellent, great.
3 minutes.
So fun, yeah. Okay, so maybe let me show like briefly an example of commercial effects of wake effects, and you see here the net present value of an investment in a wind farm, and you see it's all negative already without wake effects, which is kind of reflecting that in current circumstances, without any support from the government, like in CFD, the case may be negative, but then you can ask for a CFD strike price, so which brings you into positive. But what this shows for the specific side is all exemplary. That if you see the wake effect scenarios I talked about, like until 6.6%, then you see that there is quite an impact on the commercials of that investment. Now that is why there's all sorts of commercial of measures that you should take also as a player, like ex ante and ex post. And we heard about the risk sharing agreements, etc., and disputes already. So maybe let me come to conclusions and takeaways. One is wake effects are already there, and we expect them to gain importance significantly going forward. The impact of wake effects differ from side to side, so a very thorough understanding of them will be key for all players. There's all sorts of instruments to mitigate and manage wake effects, and stakeholders should really engage with them. As said, we expect increasing number of disputes, and we as Frontier will be ready to help in all sorts of ways. So thank you very much, and looking forward to questions and comments.
Matthias. Right, thank you so much, Matthias. We're going to move on to the Q&A now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording, which is the... Where do I do that? Oh, there we are.